I wouldn't touch something that isn't mine. Those were the last words Maria Santos spoke before her world crumbled in the marble halls of Chicago's most exclusive restaurant. The silence that followed cut deeper than any scream could have. I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're serving tables, polishing glasses, or waiting for someone to say thank you. It doesn't matter what time it is, but I promise, today's story will shake your heart. The December wind howled through the canyons of downtown Chicago, rattling the floor-to-ceiling windows of Le Noir, where crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across pristine white tablecloths. Maria Santos moved between the tables like a ghost made of grace, her black uniform crisp despite the 14-hour shift that had already stretched her thin. The scent of truffle oil and expensive wine filled the air, mingling with the soft murmur of conversations about stock portfolios, real estate investments, and cryptocurrency gains that could feed entire families for years. At 32, Maria carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned early that survival meant becoming invisible. Her dark hair was pulled back in a perfect bun, not a strand out of place, and her smile never wavered even when her feet screamed in protest against the polished hardwood floors. She had mastered the art of being present without being seen, of anticipating needs before they were spoken, of serving multimillionaires who discussed their latest Bitcoin investments while she calculated whether she could afford both groceries and her grandmother's heart medication. The restaurant was her sanctuary and her prison. For 5 years, she had walked these halls, memorizing the preferences of Chicago's elite, how Mr. Ashford liked his bourbon neat, how Mrs. Wellington insisted on fresh roses at table 7, how the venture capitalists from the North Shore preferred their conversations about dividend yields, served with the finest aged steaks. She knew their voices, their laughs, their casual dismissals of amounts that represented months of her salary. Tonight felt different. There was electricity in the air, the kind that precedes thunderstorms. Maria felt it in the way the other servers avoided eye contact, in how the kitchen staff whispered in corners, in the tension that seemed to wrap around the dining room like fog rolling in from Lake Michigan. She adjusted the small silver locket at her throat, her grandmother's last gift, and continued her rounds, unaware that her quiet, invisible existence was about to be shattered by accusations that would echo through every corner of her carefully constructed life. The warmth of the dining room contrasted sharply with the cold December night pressing against the windows, but Maria felt neither. She existed in the space between worlds, too proud to complain, too poor to escape, too dignified to let anyone see her struggle. Maria's day began at 4:30 in the morning in a cramped studio apartment on Chicago's South Side, where the L train's rumble served as her alarm clock. The walls were thin, painted a tired beige that had seen too many winters, but she had made the space her own with photographs of her grandmother, Elena, and a small altar adorned with candles and dried flowers. The apartment smelled of café con leche and the lavender soap she bought at the corner market, small luxuries that reminded her of the home she had lost. Her routine was sacred in its simplicity. She would brew coffee in a dented aluminum pot, the same one her grandmother had used for 40 years, and stand at her single window watching the city wake up. The skyline of downtown Chicago rose like a monument to dreams she couldn't afford to have, each glittering tower representing fortunes built on stock market gains, real estate empires, and cryptocurrency investments that seemed as foreign to her as space travel. The bus ride to work took an hour, snaking through neighborhoods where every block told a different story of struggle and survival. Maria would close her eyes and listen to the conversations around her. Mothers worried about rent, students discussing loans they'd never pay off, elderly passengers counting pills and quarters with equal precision. She felt their lives intertwining with hers in the shared experience of making ends meet in a city that celebrated wealth while overlooking the hands that served it. At Le Noir, she transformed. The moment she tied her apron and checked her reflection in the staff bathroom mirror, she became the version of herself that the restaurant required: polished, professional, invisible. Her co-workers, mostly women like her, understood the unspoken rules. They shared stories during brief breaks, whispered encouragements when customers were particularly demanding, and covered for each other when personal emergencies threatened their carefully balanced lives. Rosa, who worked the morning shift, was sending money to family in Honduras. Carmen had 3 children and a husband who'd been laid off from the steel plant. Jennifer was putting herself through nursing school 1 credit hour at a time. They were a sisterhood of the unseen, bound together by shared exhaustion and stubborn hope. Maria treasured the moments of unexpected kindness. When Mrs. Chen would ask about her grandmother's health, when the young businessman from the tech company would leave a generous tip with a note of appreciation, when the restaurant manager would let them take home leftover bread at the end of the night. These small gestures were anchors in a sea of indifference, reminders that her humanity wasn't entirely invisible. But tonight, as the December wind rattled the windows and the last customers lingered over their after-dinner cognac, Maria felt the weight of 5 years settling on her shoulders like snow that never melted. The humiliation began with a whisper, the way most cruelties do. Maria was clearing table 12, where Victor Reynolds sat alone, his presence filling the space like expensive cologne. His Armani suit was perfectly tailored, his platinum watch catching the light as he gestured impatiently at his phone. The Forbes magazine beside his plate was open to an article about cryptocurrency billionaires, and Maria couldn't help but notice the casual way he signed what looked like investment documents worth more money than she'd see in a lifetime. Victor Reynolds was the kind of man who commanded attention without asking for it. His packaging empire had made him one of Chicago's wealthiest bachelors, his net worth climbing steadily through strategic investments in everything from tech startups to gold futures. He spoke in numbers that made Maria's head spin. Millions in assets, portfolios diversified across international markets, Bitcoin holdings that fluctuated more in a day than she earned in a year. "Excuse me." His voice cut through the ambient noise of the dining room like a blade. "My watch is missing." The words landed in the sudden silence that follows lightning, that moment before thunder when everything holds its breath. Every head in the restaurant turned toward table 12, conversations stopping mid-sentence, forks pausing halfway to mouths. Maria felt the blood drain from her face as dozens of eyes focused on her. The poor waitress standing closest to the rich man's accusation. "Sir, I haven't seen your watch," Maria said quietly, her voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside her chest. She set down the tray she'd been holding, her hands trembling slightly. "I was only clearing your dishes." Victor's eyes were cold as Lake Michigan in January. "It was right here when I went to the restroom. Now it's gone. You were the only one at my table." The other diners began to murmur, their conversations creating a buzz of judgment that filled the elegant space like wasps in a jar. Maria could feel their assumptions crawling over her skin. The poor Mexican girl stealing from the rich white man, the servant taking advantage of her position, the predictable crime that confirmed their worst suspicions about people like her. "I wouldn't touch something that isn't mine," Maria repeated, louder this time, looking directly into Victor's eyes. Her grandmother had raised her to tell the truth even when lies would be easier, to maintain her dignity even when the world tried to strip it away. "I have never stolen anything in my life." But her words were smoke in the wind. Victor had already made up his mind, and the power structure of the restaurant, the city, the entire world seemed to bend toward his will. The manager appeared at his elbow like a nervous shadow, apologizing profusely, promising a thorough investigation, treating Victor's accusations as gospel truth, while Maria stood there, invisible again, but this time in the worst possible way. The other servers watched from a safe distance, their expressions mixing sympathy with relief that they weren't the ones under suspicion. The customers returned to their meals with renewed conversation, the drama adding spice to their expensive dinners. And Maria stood in the center of it all, her dignity intact but her world crumbling, knowing that truth and justice were luxuries she couldn't afford. The watch was found 20 minutes later, tucked behind Victor's wineglass where it had apparently slipped during the evening service. But the damage was done, the accusation hanging in the air like smoke that wouldn't clear. Victor barely glanced at Maria when the discovery was announced, offering no apology, no acknowledgement of her innocence, no recognition of the humiliation he had caused. The breaking point came with the morning sun, cold and indifferent as it cast long shadows across Chicago's awakening streets. Maria stood in the restaurant manager's office, still wearing yesterday's uniform, having barely slept after spending the night replaying every moment of her humiliation. The office smelled of stale coffee and broken dreams, its walls lined with certificates and awards that seemed to mock her presence. "I'm sorry, Maria," the manager said, not meeting her eyes. His voice carried the weight of a decision already made, delivered with the cold efficiency of a business transaction. "Mr. Reynolds is one of our most important clients. His investment group brings significant revenue to the restaurant. We can't afford to have any complications." The words hit her like a physical blow. 5 years of perfect service, countless double shifts, holidays missed with family, feet that ached from standing on marble floors, all of it erased by one man's false accusation and wounded pride. Maria felt something precious breaking inside her chest, a sound like crystal shattering that no one else could hear. "But the watch was found," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was proven innocent." The manager shuffled papers on his desk, numbers and profit margins more comfortable companions than the human consequences of his decision. "The perception matters more than the reality, Maria. Our clientele expects a certain environment. They need to feel secure." Secure. The word tasted bitter in her mouth. Secure in their assumptions, secure in their prejudices, secure in a world where people like her were disposable. Maria thought of all the secrets she'd kept, the insider trading conversations she'd overheard, the tax evasion schemes discussed over dessert, the cryptocurrency manipulation that had made some of these people rich while others lost their life savings. But none of that mattered now. She untied her apron with shaking hands, the black fabric that had been her uniform, her identity, her source of survival for 5 years. The movement felt ceremonial, like a flag being lowered or a soldier laying down arms. The restaurant had been her battlefield, and she was surrendering not because she was defeated, but because the war was rigged from the start. "My last paycheck?" she asked, folding the apron with the same care she'd given to everything else in her work. "Will be mailed to you," came the reply. As if even that small courtesy was too much trouble. Maria walked through the dining room one final time, past the tables she'd cleaned thousands of times, past the chairs where she'd served coffee to people who never learned her name. The morning light streaming through the windows seemed different now, exposing the cold marble and gleaming surfaces as the theatrical set pieces they'd always been. Her co-workers watched from doorways and behind service stations, their eyes filled with sympathy and the terrible knowledge that they were all just one accusation away from the same fate. At the employee exit, Maria paused and touched the small silver locket at her throat, feeling her grandmother's presence in the cold metal. Elena had been a seamstress, another invisible woman who'd worked her fingers to the bone for people who saw her only as a service. But she'd taught Maria that dignity wasn't something that could be taken away. It was something you carried inside, like a flame that burns even in the coldest wind. The silence that followed Maria's departure settled over Le Bernardin Noir like dust over abandoned furniture. The restaurant continued to operate with mechanical precision. Orders were taken, meals were served, payments were processed, but something essential had been lost, like a song missing its keynote. The other servers moved more carefully now, their conversations muted, their smiles forced. Rose's hands shook slightly as she poured wine, remembering her own close calls with demanding customers. Carmen found herself double-checking every detail, terrified of making the smallest mistake that might cost her the job her children depended on. Jennifer worked her shifts in virtual silence, no longer sharing stories or dreams of nursing school, the future suddenly feeling more fragile than glass. The customers noticed nothing. They arrived in their expensive cars, discussed their investment portfolios over appetizers, and left generous tips that felt more like guilty consciences than genuine appreciation. The Bitcoin market was surging, they said, their cryptocurrency holdings adding millions to their net worth, while they debated whether to diversify into gold or stick with their stock portfolios. Victor Reynolds returned the following week, taking his usual table as if nothing had happened. He ordered his standard meal, the aged Wagyu beef, the bottle of wine worth more than most people's monthly salary, and conducted business over dessert, signing documents that moved vast sums between accounts, while Maria's former co-workers served him with professional smiles that never reached their eyes. But something had changed in Victor too, though he wouldn't admit it to himself. The food tasted different now, less satisfying somehow. The wine seemed bitter. The conversations about merger deals and acquisition targets felt hollow. He caught himself looking for Maria, expecting to see her quiet competence, her respectful nods, her invisible presence that had somehow made the restaurant feel more complete. The manager hired a replacement quickly, a young woman named Ashley who smiled too much and laughed too loudly at the customers' jokes. She was eager and desperate, qualities that made her pliable but couldn't replicate the steady grace that Maria had brought to the role. The new dynamic felt artificial, like a play where one of the main characters had been replaced, but everyone pretended not to notice. In the kitchen, the staff whispered about Maria's fate. Some had her number, but their calls went unanswered. She had vanished into the city like smoke, disappearing into the network of invisible workers who kept Chicago running. The housekeepers and security guards, the early morning vendors and late-night cleaners, all of them carrying their dignity in silence. The restaurant's weekly staff meeting felt different too. The manager spoke about customer service and maintaining standards, but his words rang hollow after what had happened to Maria. The employees nodded and took notes. But trust had been broken, the illusion shattered that hard work and honesty would be rewarded, or at least protected. Winter settled over the city like a heavy coat, and the silence where Maria's laughter used to be grew more profound with each passing day. 3 months passed before the truth surfaced, emerging like a body from a frozen lake that had finally thawed. Victor Reynolds sat in his lawyer's mahogany-paneled office, surrounded by the trappings of wealth that usually made him feel invincible. Paintings worth millions, a view of Lake Michigan that cost more per month than most people earned in a year, documents detailing investment portfolios that spanned continents and currencies. James Morrison, Victor's attorney and oldest friend, had requested the meeting with unusual urgency. His normally composed demeanor showed cracks of discomfort as he shuffled through a manila folder that seemed to burn his fingers. The office smelled of leather and expensive cigars, but today it felt more like a confessional than a sanctuary. "Victor, we need to discuss what happened at the restaurant," James began, his voice carrying the weight of a secret that had been eating at him for weeks. "About Maria Santos and your watch." Victor looked up from his phone where he'd been checking his cryptocurrency portfolio, Bitcoin prices fluctuating in real time like a digital heartbeat of greed and anxiety. His net worth had increased by several $1,000,000 since morning, but the numbers felt meaningless in the face of his friend's somber expression. "That's ancient history, James." The matter was resolved. No, it wasn't. James opened the folder and withdrew a USB drive, its silver surface reflecting the afternoon light like an accusation. "Security footage from the restaurant. I finally convinced the manager to review all the cameras from that night." The revelation unfolded on James's computer screen like a silent movie of betrayal. The timestamp read 9:47 p.m., just after Victor had accused Maria. The camera angles showed the dining room from above, capturing every movement with crystal clarity. There was Maria, clearing tables with her usual grace. There was Victor, returning from the restroom. And there, in the corner of the frame, was Bradley Chen, Victor's personal assistant and trusted confidant for 7 years. The footage showed Bradley approaching Victor's table during the brief moment when both Victor and Maria were away. His movements were quick, practiced, calculated. He lifted the expensive watch from beside Victor's place setting and slipped it into his jacket pocket, then positioned himself near the service station to observe the chaos that would follow. "My God," Victor whispered, his voice barely audible above the hum of the city beyond the windows. "Bradley? But why would he—" "Gambling debts," James replied, his tone flat with professional disappointment. "He's been stealing from you for months, Victor. Small amounts from petty cash, shifting numbers in expense reports. But that watch, it was worth enough to clear his debts to some very dangerous people." The second part of the revelation was even more devastating. The footage showed Bradley 25 minutes later, during the height of the search for the missing watch, quietly returning to Victor's table. He placed the watch behind the wine glass with the same casual precision he'd used to steal it, creating the illusion that it had simply been overlooked. Victor felt sick, his stomach churning with the realization of his own blindness. He had trusted Bradley with his business secrets, his financial records, access to his investment accounts and cryptocurrency wallets. The man had been present during sensitive negotiations about acquisitions and stock purchases, privy to information worth millions of dollars. "He set up that innocent woman," Victor said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "He let me destroy her life to save his own." James nodded grimly. The other staff members knew about his gambling, Victor. They were afraid to speak up because he had influence with management. He'd been pushing for Maria to be fired for months, claiming she was unreliable, trying to undermine her reputation. The room fell silent, except for the distant sound of traffic and the whispered secrets of a city that never stopped moving. Victor stared at the frozen image on the screen. Maria's face, her expression of quiet dignity, even in the face of false accusations. He remembered her words, "I wouldn't touch something that isn't mine." They echoed in his mind now with the weight of absolute truth. The revelation shattered more than Victor's trust in his assistant. It cracked the foundation of his worldview, the comfortable assumptions that had allowed him to sleep peacefully in his penthouse, while an innocent woman lost her livelihood because of his pride and prejudice. The wealth that surrounded him, the art, the view, the portfolio worth hundreds of millions, all of it felt tainted now by his own moral blindness. Finding Maria proved harder than Victor had anticipated, his wealth and connections surprisingly useless in locating a woman who had vanished into Chicago's invisible workforce. Private investigators, social media searches, even hiring former colleagues to ask around yielded nothing. Maria Santos had disappeared as completely as if the city had swallowed her whole. It was a snowy evening in March when Victor finally spotted her through the frost-covered windows of a small cafe on the south side, miles from the gleaming towers of downtown. The Corazon Café was everything Le Bernardin Noir was not: cramped, loud, filled with the earthy aroma of roasted coffee and the warm chatter of working families. Christmas lights strung along the walls cast a golden glow over mismatched tables and chairs that had seen better decades. Maria stood behind the counter, her hair still pulled back in the same careful bun, her movements still carrying that unconscious grace that had caught his eye months ago. But something was different. Her smile seemed more genuine now, reaching her eyes when she laughed with customers who called her by name. She wore a simple white apron over jeans and a sweater, working for people who saw her as a person rather than a service. Victor sat in his car for an hour, watching through the windows, trying to gather courage he'd never needed in boardrooms or merger negotiations. His wealth felt like armor that had become too heavy to carry, insulating him from the world he'd damaged. Inside that modest cafe, Maria moved between tables with the same dignity she'd shown at the restaurant, but here it wasn't invisible. It was celebrated, appreciated, returned with genuine warmth from customers who understood the value of honest work. When he finally entered the cafe, the warm air hit him like a physical embrace. Conversations in Spanish and English blended together, creating a soundtrack of community that was foreign to his usual environment of hushed negotiations and stock market updates. The customers looked at him curiously, his expensive coat and tailored suit marking him as an outsider, but without hostility. Maria saw him immediately, her hand freezing on the coffee pot she'd been holding. The recognition was instant, followed by a flash of something that might have been fear before her professional composure reasserted itself. She finished serving her customer, whispered something to the woman working beside her, and approached his table with the same quiet strength she'd shown that terrible night months ago. "Mr. Reynolds," she said simply, her voice neutral as Switzerland. "What can I get you?" The question was both literal and existential. What could she get him? Forgiveness? Peace? A chance to undo the damage he'd caused? Victor looked up at her, seeing clearly for perhaps the first time the woman he'd wronged so profoundly. "Coffee would be fine," he said, his voice rougher than he had intended. "And maybe 5 minutes of your time?" Maria poured his coffee without comment, the rich aroma filling the space between them like an offering. She set the cup down gently and sat across from him, her posture straight, her eyes wary but not unkind. The cafe continued its warm bustle around them, but their table felt like an island of reckoning in a sea of ordinary life. "I know why you're here," Maria said quietly, her hands folded on the table. "And I know what Bradley did." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they could cross. Victor studied her face, searching for signs of the anger he deserved, the bitterness he had earned. Instead, he found something far more unsettling, a peace that spoke of battles fought and won, of dignity maintained through the worst kind of trial. The redemption began not with grand gestures or dramatic apologies, but with the simple act of Victor Reynolds listening, truly listening, to a woman he'd been trained by society and privilege never to see. Maria spoke quietly in the warm glow of the Corazon Café, her words cutting through years of assumptions like light through darkness. "I wasn't angry about losing the job," she said, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "Jobs come and go. I was angry about losing my voice. When you accused me, every customer in that restaurant heard your version of the truth, but no one waited to hear mine." Victor felt each word like a physical blow, understanding for the first time the weight of his power and how carelessly he'd wielded it. His investment portfolio might be worth hundreds of millions, his cryptocurrency holdings might fluctuate by fortunes daily, but none of that wealth had prepared him for the poverty of his own character in that moment. "I was wrong," he said simply, "completely, inexcusably wrong. I destroyed your reputation, your livelihood, You tried to destroy my dignity," Maria interrupted gently. "But that's something only I can give away." The conversation stretched over 2 hours, customers coming and going around them as Chicago's evening settled over the city like a familiar blanket. Maria told him about the weeks after her firing, the job interviews that ended when references were checked, the slow erosion of her savings, the nights she'd lain awake wondering if she'd ever find work again. But she also told him about this cafe, owned by Mrs. Delgado, who'd hired her without calling Le Bernardin Noir, who trusted her story over any reference. "The people here know my worth," Maria said, gesturing to the customers who waved at her from across the room. "They see me, really see me." Victor looked around the cafe with new eyes, noticing the way customers lingered over conversations, how children did homework at corner tables while their mothers worked double shifts, how Maria remembered everyone's usual order and asked about their families. This wasn't just a business, it was a community, something his world of mergers and acquisitions had never taught him to value. When he finally made his offer, it wasn't what either of them expected. Not charity, not guilt money, but an actual partnership. Victor had been considering expanding his business interests beyond packaging and investments, looking into hospitality and community development. The cafe represented something authentic that all his wealth couldn't buy. "I want to help you expand this place," he said carefully, "not take it over, not change what makes it special. Just provide the capital to reach more people, to create more jobs, to build something that matters." Maria studied his face for a long moment, searching for traces of the man who'd humiliated her months ago. What she found instead was someone transformed by the weight of his own mistakes, someone learning to see the world beyond his balance sheets and portfolio statements. "Why?" she asked simply. "Because you taught me that wealth without dignity is just expensive emptiness," Victor replied. "And because I want to spend the rest of my life trying to deserve the forgiveness you've already given me." The partnership that emerged over the following months surprised everyone, including Victor and Maria themselves. The Corazon Café became the flagship of a small chain of community-centered restaurants, each one hiring from the local neighborhood, each one designed to serve as a gathering place rather than just a business. Victor learned to listen to voices he'd never heard before: single mothers balancing 2 jobs, immigrants sending money home to family, students working their way through college 1 shift at a time. His cryptocurrency investments still fluctuated wildly. His stock portfolio still generated millions in dividends, but he found himself more interested in the stories of the people his restaurants employed than in the financial reports from his traditional businesses. The transformation wasn't easy or quick. Victor had to confront the racism and classism that had made his initial judgment of Maria possible. He attended community meetings in neighborhoods he'd never visited, learned about food deserts and gentrification, discovered that his wealth could be a tool for building up rather than just accumulating. Maria became the face of the restaurant expansion, traveling to new locations, training managers, building the culture of dignity and respect that made each cafe special. She appeared on local television shows, was interviewed by business magazines, and spoke at conferences about hospitality and community building. The woman who'd once been invisible was now helping others find their voices. The irony wasn't lost on either of them that it took an act of profound injustice to create something beautiful. The watch that had started it all, the expensive timepiece that represented everything wrong with Victor's old world view, was eventually donated to a charity auction, its value transformed from a symbol of status to a source of hope for others. Bradley Chen, the assistant who'd orchestrated the entire cruel deception, was prosecuted for theft and fraud. But even his trial became a teaching moment about the pressures that drive good people to desperate acts, the gambling addiction that had pushed him to betray trust and destroy an innocent woman's life. Victor testified not for revenge, but for understanding, hoping that justice might come with compassion. 1 year after that terrible December night, Maria and Victor stood together at the opening of their 5th cafe, this one in an underserved neighborhood where many residents had never imagined owning a business or having their voices heard in corporate meetings. The ribbon-cutting ceremony was attended by families, city council members, and reporters, all gathered to celebrate something unprecedented, a partnership born from injustice but nurtured by redemption. As autumn painted Chicago in shades of gold and crimson, Maria Santos stood in the original Corazon Café, now expanded but still warmed by the same community spirit that had made it special. The morning rush was in full swing, construction workers grabbing coffee before dawn shifts, nurses heading home from overnight rounds, students settling in with textbooks and dreams. Through the large windows, she could see the city awakening, the same skyline that had once seemed so distant, now feeling like home. The L train rumbled past on schedule, carrying stories and struggles and small victories to every corner of Chicago. In her pocket, she still carried her grandmother's silver locket, but now it felt less like a burden of the past and more like a blessing for the future. Victor entered as he did every Tuesday morning, no longer the imposing figure who'd once commanded attention through wealth and position. He'd learned to listen before speaking, to ask questions instead of making assumptions, to see the people behind the services he'd once taken for granted. His expensive suits had given way to simpler clothes, his phone stayed in his pocket during conversations, and his eyes held the light of someone who'd found purpose beyond profit margins. "The quarterly reports look good," he told Maria, setting down a folder of financial statements. Their restaurant group was thriving, not just financially but socially, creating jobs and gathering spaces in communities that had been overlooked by traditional investors. The numbers showed growth in revenue and employment, but more importantly, they showed growth in belonging. More importantly, Maria replied, Mrs. Chen says her son got into college. The scholarship program is working. They had established an education fund for employees' children, using profits from the restaurants to break cycles of poverty and open doors that had been locked by circumstances of birth. It was a small program, helping a few dozen students pay for college or trade school, but each success story rippled outward like stones thrown in still water. The morning passed in comfortable routine, Maria moving between tables with the grace that had never left her, Victor reviewing business plans that prioritized people alongside profit, both of them learning daily what it meant to build something meaningful rather than just profitable. Around them, the cafe hummed with conversations in multiple languages, children's laughter mixing with coffee orders and friendly arguments about sports teams. A young woman approached their table, her restaurant uniform crisp and her eyes bright with nervous excitement. Sarah Martinez was their newest manager, promoted from server after showing the same combination of competence and compassion that Maria embodied. She represented the future they were trying to build, opportunity based on merit, advancement rooted in character. Mr. Reynolds, Ms. Santos, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the importance of what she was about to share. I wanted to thank you both. My mother called this morning. She's coming to the opening of the new location next month. She'll be able to see what I've built here. The pride in Sarah's voice was worth more than any dividend payment or stock appreciation. She was the daughter of immigrants, the first in her family to manage a business, living proof that the American dream was still alive for those brave enough to serve it with dignity. As the afternoon sun slanted through the cafe windows, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floors, Maria felt the weight of the journey that had brought her to this moment. The humiliation at Le Bernardin Noir seemed like another lifetime now, a necessary darkness that had led to unexpected light. She thought of all the women who'd shared her experience, servers and housekeepers, retail workers and healthcare aides, invisible hands that kept the world running while being ignored by those they served. Some would find their voices and their value, as she had. Others would continue to work in silence, their dignity intact but unrecognized. All of them deserved better. Victor watched her from across the table, recognizing the contemplative expression that meant she was thinking beyond the immediate moment. He had learned to read her moods, to understand that her quiet nature masked depths of wisdom he was still discovering. Their partnership had taught him that listening was a skill, that empathy required practice, that true leadership meant lifting others up rather than standing above them. "What are you thinking about?" he asked gently. "All the women who served coffee to me when I was growing up," Maria replied. "My grandmother's friends, my neighbors, women who worked double shifts so their children could have better lives. They never got recognition ceremonies or business partnerships, but they were heroes too." The conversation that followed touched on legacy and responsibility, on the weight of example and the power of story. They discussed plans for their next restaurant, but also for scholarship programs in community gardens, for job training initiatives, and small business loans. Their success had given them a platform, and they were learning to use it wisely. As evening settled over Chicago, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold that rivaled any expensive artwork, Maria and Victor prepared to lock up the cafe. The last customers were a young couple sharing a single piece of cake, their conversation filled with dreams and plans for their future. They reminded Maria of herself at that age, when possibilities seemed infinite and love could overcome any obstacle. The months that followed brought challenges they hadn't anticipated. Success, they discovered, came with its own burdens. Business magazine articles brought new investors interested in scaling their model, corporate consultants promising to streamline their operations, and franchising offers that could have made them both incredibly wealthy overnight. During one particularly difficult board meeting in the spring, a venture capitalist named Harrison Blake spread charts and projections across the conference table like tarot cards predicting fortune. His presentation was slick, professional, filled with terms like market penetration and operational efficiency that reduced their community-centered approach to numbers on a spreadsheet. "You're leaving money on the table," Blake insisted, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd never worked a service job. "With proper systematization, we could have 50 locations operational within 18 months. Your current model is quaint, but it doesn't scale." Maria and Victor exchanged glances across the polished conference table, surrounded by suits and spreadsheets that felt foreign to the heart of what they'd built. The Corazon model wasn't just about serving coffee and food. It was about serving humanity, creating spaces where dignity flourished alongside profit. But Blake's presentation made it clear that such idealistic notions were obstacles to overcome, not values to preserve. "Our current model works because it's personal," Maria said quietly, her voice cutting through Blake's aggressive enthusiasm. "Each location reflects its community. Each manager knows their customers' names, their stories, their struggles. You can't systematize humanity." Blake's smile was patronizing, the kind Maria remembered from her days at Le Bernardin Noir, when wealthy customers assumed she couldn't understand complex conversations happening around her. "Ms. Santos, with respect, sentiment doesn't generate shareholder value. We're talking about expanding your reach, helping more people, creating more jobs." "Creating more profits, you mean?" Victor interjected, surprising himself with the sharpness in his voice. He'd been in countless meetings like this before, had made millions through the very kind of aggressive expansion Blake was proposing. But those deals had been about numbers on balance sheets, not about the actual people behind the paychecks. The meeting ended without agreement, Blake and his associates departing with barely concealed frustration at what they saw as naive idealism standing in the way of obvious opportunity. After they left, Maria and Victor sat in the empty conference room, surrounded by the detritus of corporate ambition, discarded presentation materials, half-empty coffee cups, and the lingering scent of expensive cologne. "We could be rich," Victor said finally, though the word tasted strange in his mouth. He was already rich by any reasonable measure. But Blake was talking about the kind of wealth that transcended mere millions, the kind that appeared on Forbes covers and commanded audiences with world leaders. "We already are," Maria replied, looking out the window at the city skyline. "Rich in purpose, rich in community, rich in the knowledge that we're building something that matters." The decision to decline Blake's offer wasn't difficult, but its consequences were. Other investors lost interest when word spread that the Corazon Group wasn't interested in rapid expansion. Business magazines that had once courted interviews began portraying their approach as quaint but ultimately unsustainable in the modern marketplace. More challenging were the internal pressures. Some of their own managers, eager for advancement and higher salaries, began questioning why they were turning down opportunities for growth. A few key employees left for competitors, offering traditional corporate structures and clearer paths to executive positions. During this period of doubt and transition, Maria found herself returning often to her grandmother's memory. Elena had never owned a business, never appeared in newspapers, never had the opportunity to choose between profit and principle on such a scale. But she'd lived her values daily, treating every customer with dignity, whether they were wealthy socialites or struggling students, finding joy in work well done rather than just in paychecks earned. One evening, as Maria was closing the original cafe, she noticed an elderly man sitting alone at a corner table, nursing a single cup of coffee that had grown cold hours ago. His clothes were clean but worn, his hands calloused from decades of labor, his eyes carrying the particular weariness of someone who'd worked hard all his life, but still struggled to make ends meet. "We're closing soon, Mr. Garcia," Maria said gently, recognizing one of their regular customers who always ordered the smallest size coffee and made it last as long as possible. "I know," he replied, starting to gather his things. "Just giving the legs a rest before the walk home." Maria understood immediately. Mr. Garcia was homeless, using the cafe as shelter during the day, treating his single coffee purchase like rent for a few hours of warmth and dignity. That night, she called Victor at home, interrupting what she knew would be his evening review of market reports and investment portfolios. "I have an idea," she said without preamble. "What if we opened 1 hour earlier and stayed open 1 hour later? Created a breakfast program for people who are struggling, a place where dignity comes with the meal?" Victor's response was immediate. "How much would it cost?" "That's not the question," Maria replied. "The question is, how much would it be worth?" Within a month, all 5 Corazon locations had implemented what they called the Open Door program. Anyone could work for an hour, sweeping floors, wiping tables, organizing supplies, and earn a full breakfast. No applications, no background checks, no judgment. Just work in exchange for dignity and a good meal. The program created its own community within the larger community of each cafe. Regular customers began arriving earlier to volunteer alongside program participants, sharing stories over mops and coffee cups. Children did homework at tables cleaned by elderly neighbors who'd become surrogate grandparents. College students tutored adults working toward GEDs, while both groups shared meals they'd helped prepare. Business magazines that had once criticized their lack of aggressive expansion began featuring the Open Door program as an innovative approach to corporate social responsibility. But Maria and Victor knew it wasn't innovation. It was simply the logical extension of values they'd always held. The program's success brought new challenges and new opportunities. Social service agencies began referring clients to the cafes. Local politicians started visiting for photo opportunities that made Maria uncomfortable, but expanded the program's visibility and support. A documentary filmmaker approached them about telling their story, seeing in their partnership a narrative of redemption and transformation that would resonate with audiences hungry for hope. As summer settled over Chicago, bringing with it the particular energy of a city finally freed from winter's grip, Maria found herself reflecting on the distance she'd traveled from that humiliating night at Le Bernardin Noir. The woman who'd been accused of theft was now being honored by the mayor for community service. The server who'd been fired for someone else's crime was now creating jobs and opportunities for hundreds of people. But success brought its own temptations. Speaking engagements paid well and spread their message, but took time away from the daily work of running the cafes. Media attention brought customers and donations, but also scrutiny and expectations that felt increasingly heavy. The simple joy of serving coffee and connecting with neighbors was getting lost in the complexity of managing a movement. It was during this period of overwhelming success that Maria received a phone call that would once again test everything she'd learned about forgiveness, justice, and the price of dignity. The voice on the phone was unfamiliar, professional, cautious in the way of lawyers who'd rather be speaking to other lawyers. "Ms. Santos, my name is Patricia Williams from the firm Williams, Burke & Associates. I represent Le Bernardin Noir restaurant." Maria's blood went cold. It had been over 2 years since her firing, 2 years since Victor's false accusation had shattered her world and eventually led to its reconstruction on more solid ground. She'd assumed the chapter of her life was closed. The injustice, if not resolved, then at least consigned to the past where it couldn't hurt her anymore. "How can I help you?" Maria asked, her voice steady despite the tremor in her heart. "The restaurant is facing a lawsuit from another former employee, similar circumstances to your situation. The plaintiff's attorney has requested all documentation related to employee terminations during the past 3 years. Your case has come up as part of our review." Maria understood immediately. Someone else had been falsely accused, fired unjustly, and was fighting back through the legal system in a way she'd never been able to afford. Her story would become evidence in someone else's battle for dignity and justice. "What do you need from me?" she asked. The lawyer's pause was pregnant with meanings Maria could sense, but not entirely decode. "We're prepared to offer you a settlement, Ms. Santos. a substantial sum in exchange for your discretion regarding the circumstances of your termination. We believe it would be mutually beneficial to resolve any potential claims you might have against the restaurant." The offer was significant, 6 figures, enough to expand the Corazon locations, to fund scholarships for 100 students, to transform her community work from successful local initiative into regional institution. All in exchange for silence, for agreeing that her humiliation had never happened, that the injustice she'd suffered was worth no more than a number on a check. "I need time to think about it," Maria said, though she already knew her answer. The conversation with Victor that evening took place in the original cafe after closing, the space quiet, except for the distant hum of the city beyond the windows. Maria had explained the situation, the offer, the implications of accepting or refusing what amounted to hush money for injustice. "It's a lot of money," Victor said carefully, his business mind automatically calculating the good they could do with such a windfall. "Think of how many people we could help." "Think of how many people we'd abandon," Maria replied. "Every server who gets falsely accused, every worker who gets fired for someone else's crime. If I take their money and promise to stay quiet, I become part of the system that keeps people like me invisible." Victor nodded, understanding the distinction she was making between financial success and moral victory. His own wealth had insulated him from such impossible choices for most of his life. But his partnership with Maria had taught him that some prices were too high to pay, even when you could afford them. "What will you tell them?" he asked. "The truth," Maria said simply, "that my story isn't for sale." The call to decline the settlement offer was brief, professional, and final. Patricia Williams seemed neither surprised nor particularly disappointed, suggesting that the restaurant's legal team had expected this outcome. They knew Maria well enough now to understand that the woman who'd rebuilt her life on principles of dignity and community wouldn't compromise those values for money. But the legal machinations were just beginning. As expected, Maria received a subpoena to testify in the case brought by Jennifer Walsh, a former server whose experience mirrored Maria's own, a wealthy customer's missing item, a quick accusation, a firing despite innocence eventually proven. The difference was that Jennifer had access to legal representation, resources to fight back, and Maria's story as precedent. The deposition was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in downtown Chicago, in one of those glass towers Maria had once watched from her apartment window, dreaming dreams she couldn't afford. Accompanied by Victor and an attorney he'd hired despite her protests, Maria rode the elevator to the 37th floor, watching the city shrink below them as they rose toward what felt like Judgment Day. The conference room was all mahogany and marble, designed to intimidate through displays of power and wealth. Representatives from Le Bernardin Noir sat on one side of an imposing table, their lawyers arranged like a defensive wall between their clients and accountability. On the other side sat Jennifer Walsh, younger than Maria but with the same quiet strength that came from surviving injustice, and her legal team, David and Goliath, preparing for battle. Maria's testimony lasted 4 hours, every detail of her employment and termination examined, questioned, challenged, and verified. She spoke about the night Victor accused her, about the watch that had never been stolen, about the firing that came despite her innocence. But she also spoke about the months that followed, about finding work at the cafe, about building something better from the ashes of injustice. The restaurant's attorneys tried to portray her current success as evidence that she hadn't been damaged by their treatment, that her thriving business empire proved their firing had actually been beneficial. It was a legal strategy that revealed more about their character than their competence, the suggestion that injustice was acceptable if its victims eventually prospered despite it. "Would you do it again?" Jennifer's attorney asked toward the end of Maria's testimony. "Knowing what the consequences would be, would you still speak up, still defend your integrity even if it cost you your job?" Maria looked across the table at the restaurant representatives, some of whom she recognized from her years of invisible service. They'd consumed thousands of meals she'd served, benefited from countless hours of her labor, profited from her dedication and discretion. None of them met her eyes now. "Yes," she said quietly, "because dignity isn't something you can afford to lose, even when you can't afford to keep it." The case eventually settled out of court for an undisclosed sum, but the process had accomplished something more valuable than any monetary judgment. Le Bernardin Noir quietly implemented new policies for handling customer complaints against employees, requiring security footage review before any termination decision, establishing an appeals process for wrongful termination claims. More importantly, word of the case spread through Chicago's restaurant industry like ripples from a stone thrown in still water. Servers began asserting their rights more confidently, knowing they weren't powerless against customer accusations. Restaurant managers started questioning wealthy patrons' claims instead of automatically believing them. The culture of "the customer is always right" began evolving toward something more nuanced and fair. But the victory felt bittersweet to Maria, justice delayed and incomplete. How many other women had suffered in silence during the years between her firing and Jeffrey's lawsuit? How many quiet servers had been sacrificed to wealthy customers' wounded pride while she was building her new life? These questions haunted her as autumn turned to winter, as the Corazon cafes adapted their open-door program to serve hot soup and warm clothing along with dignity and employment. The success they'd built felt fragile in the face of such large-scale injustice, their small community of fairness, an island in an ocean of systemic inequality. It was during this period of moral complexity that Maria received an unexpected visitor, Rosa Martinez, her former colleague from Le Bernardin Noir, the woman who'd sent money to family in Honduras and worried about making mortgage payments while serving wine that cost more than her monthly salary. Rosa looked older, worn down by years of service industry work that demanded everything and offered little security in return. She'd heard about Maria's success through mutual friends, about the cafes and the partnership with Victor, and the transformation from accused thief to celebrated community leader. "I'm proud of you," Rosa said, accepting the coffee Maria had poured with hands that still trembled slightly from old habits of nervous servitude. "You got out. You won." "We all should have won," Maria replied. "The system was broken for all of us." Rosa laughed, but it wasn't a sound of joy. "The system still is broken. Ashley, remember Ashley who replaced you? She got fired last month. Customer said she was rude, complained to management. No investigation, no appeal, just gone." The news hit Maria like a physical blow, proof that her victory had been personal rather than systematic, that changing her own life hadn't changed the larger patterns of abuse and disposability that governed service work. Ashley had been eager and desperate, qualities that made her vulnerable to exactly the kind of treatment Maria had endured. That night, Maria called Victor with an idea that had been building in her mind for months, crystallized by Rosa's visit and Ashley's story. If they couldn't change the entire restaurant industry overnight, they could at least create a model that others might follow, a demonstration that profit and principle could coexist. "What if we opened a place downtown?" she said. "Not another Corazon location, something different. A restaurant that competes directly with places like Le Bernardin Noir, but operates by different values." Victor was silent for a long moment, calculating costs and risks and probable outcomes. "That market is unforgiving," he said finally. "Those customers expect a certain level of service, a particular kind of atmosphere. They're not interested in our community-building approach." "Then we'll give them service they've never experienced before," Maria replied. "Real service, not servitude. Dignity instead of invisibility. Excellence without exploitation." The idea grew over the following weeks, sketches and business plans spreading across the cafe tables like maps of a new world they were trying to build. Not a community cafe this time, but a fine dining establishment that would compete on quality while refusing to compromise on values. They would pay above-market wages, provide full benefits, create advancement opportunities, and most importantly, establish policies that protected staff dignity while maintaining customer satisfaction. Finding the right location took months. Downtown Chicago real estate was expensive, especially for the kind of prestige address that would signal to Le Bernardin Noir's clientele that this wasn't some well-intentioned charity project, but a serious competitor. Eventually, they found space in a restored Art Deco building on North Michigan Avenue, all soaring ceilings and elegant details that whispered of old money while accommodating new values. The renovation took 6 months. Every detail carefully considered to create an atmosphere of elegance without intimidation, luxury without arrogance. The dining room featured locally sourced artwork instead of European masters, comfortable seating that welcomed rather than commanded, and an open kitchen design that made the staff visible as skilled professionals rather than invisible servants. Training the staff required unlearning decades of industry practices. Servers were encouraged to engage with customers as equals, to make recommendations based on expertise rather than just agreement, to feel confident in their knowledge and authority. The kitchen operated on principles of cooperation rather than hierarchy. With head chef David Morales, another refugee from fine dining's traditional brutality, creating an environment where creativity flourished alongside respect. Most radical was the mistake policy. Any error, from a mispoured wine to an incorrectly prepared dish, would be handled by management rather than blamed on individual staff members. Customers who became abusive or made inappropriate accusations would be courteously treated, but not automatically believed, with security cameras and witness testimony protecting workers from false claims. The opening night was December 15th, exactly 3 years after Maria's firing from Le Bernardin Noir. The symmetry wasn't accidental. She'd chosen the date deliberately, transforming the anniversary of her lowest moment into the celebration of her highest achievement. Victor wore a simple black suit instead of his usual designer armor, more comfortable now in his role as partner than patron. Maria moved through the dining room in an elegant dress rather than a servant's uniform, greeting customers as equals, her dignity finally visible to everyone who mattered. The restaurant they had created together defied easy categorization. Vita Nova, New Life, offered cuisine that rivaled the city's most expensive establishments while maintaining price points that working families could occasionally afford. The wine list featured selections from immigrant vintners and family-owned vineyards, alongside traditional prestige labels. The atmosphere was sophisticated without being stuffy, elegant without being exclusive. But what truly set Vita Nova apart was harder to quantify. An energy that came from staff who felt valued and supported, a warmth that radiated from people working with dignity rather than desperation. Customers noticed immediately that servers seemed more confident, more knowledgeable, more genuinely engaged. The food was exceptional, but the experience was transformative. Word spread quickly through Chicago's dining scene. Food critics who came expecting to find flaws in the social experiment instead discovered innovative cuisine prepared by passionate chefs, knowledgeable service delivered by proud professionals, and an atmosphere that elevated everyone it touched. Within months, reservations were booked weeks in advance, and other restaurants began quietly inquiring about Vita Nova's employment practices. The irony of success was that it attracted exactly the kind of customers Maria had once served invisibly at Le Bernardin Noir. Wealthy executives brought clients to Vita Nova, cryptocurrency millionaires celebrated deals over expensive wines, investment bankers discussed portfolios while consuming artfully plated entrees. But now these conversations happened in an environment where the staff's dignity was protected, where false accusations would be investigated rather than believed, where no single customer's demands could destroy someone's livelihood. Victor Reynolds still ate at Vita Nova regularly, taking his usual table near the windows overlooking Michigan Avenue. But now he was just another customer, his wealth and influence no longer giving him the power to damage lives with careless accusations. The watch he wore now was simple, functional, chosen for reliability rather than status. He'd learned that true luxury wasn't about what you owned, but about how you treated the people who made your life possible. Maria moved between both worlds now, the community-rooted Corazon cafes and the sophisticated elegance of Vita Nova, understanding that social change required multiple approaches, different tools for different challenges. The cafes served neighborhoods that needed gathering places and economic opportunities. The restaurant competed in markets that needed examples of how excellence and ethics could coexist. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came 6 months after opening, when Ashley Chen, the former Le Bernardin Noir server who'd been fired after Maria's departure, walked into Vita Nova looking for work. Her application was processed like any other, her experience evaluated on its merits rather than her history of false accusations and unfair termination. Ashley became one of Vita Nova's best servers, her eagerness tempered by the security of knowing she worked in an environment that would protect rather than sacrifice her if problems arose. She embodied the restaurant's mission in human terms, proof that people flourished when treated with dignity, that excellence emerged when fear was replaced with support. The success of both ventures attracted national attention, business schools writing case studies about their model, management consultants trying to quantify their approach to employee relations. Maria and Victor were invited to speak at conferences about hospitality, community development, and the intersection of profit and purpose. But they remained rooted in the daily work of running businesses that served food and built community, understanding that their best advocacy was simply doing the work well. Christmas Eve found Maria in the original Corazon Café, serving hot soup and warm conversation to customers who'd become friends, neighbors who'd become family. Snow fell softly outside the windows, coating Chicago in that temporary peace that makes even the hardest city seem gentle. Mr. Garcia sat at his usual corner table, no longer homeless thanks to connections made through the Open Door program, now volunteering to help others navigate the same transition he had successfully made. Victor joined her as closing time approached, rolling up his sleeves to help with the final cleanup, a ritual that had become sacred to both of them. They worked in comfortable silence, wiping tables and stacking chairs, turning off lights and locking doors, partners in purpose as well as business. "Do you ever think about that night?" Victor asked as they stood on the sidewalk, their breath visible in the cold air, the city's lights reflecting off fresh snow like scattered diamonds. "Every day," Maria replied, "but not the way I used to. It doesn't hurt anymore. It taught me who I really am." They parted ways at the corner where their paths home diverged, Victor to his downtown penthouse that he'd redesigned as a comfortable home rather than a status symbol, Maria to an apartment in the same neighborhood as the original cafe, larger now and filled with light, but still grounded in the community that had welcomed her when wealth and power had cast her out. As Maria walked the familiar streets, she passed other restaurants, other cafes, other places where invisible hands served visible customers. In windows lit against the winter night, she saw servers moving with the careful grace she recognized, hosts greeting customers with smiles that might or might not reach their eyes, bartenders polishing glasses while listening to conversations about stock prices and Bitcoin values that represented more money than they'd earn in years. Some of those workers would find their voices, as she had. Others would continue to serve in silence, their dignity intact, even if unrecognized. But now, there were at least a few places in Chicago where dignity was visible, where excellence didn't require exploitation, where service came with respect. The snow continued to fall, covering the city like grace, and Maria Santos walked home on streets she'd helped make a little more just, carrying in her heart the quiet satisfaction of work well done and wrongs slowly being righted. Behind her, the lights of Vita Nova glowed against the night sky, a beacon of possibility in a world that was learning, slowly but surely, to see the people who serve it. Her grandmother's locket caught the streetlight as she walked, the silver surface reflecting the city's glow like a small star against the darkness. Elena's spirit lived on in every cup of coffee served with dignity, every job created with justice, every life touched by the simple revolutionary act of treating service workers as human beings worthy of respect. The bells of a distant church chimed midnight, Christmas morning arriving with the soft persistence of snow and the bright promise of new beginnings. In her pocket, Maria felt the weight of keys to the cafe, to the restaurant, to doors she'd opened for others who'd been locked out of opportunity. But most importantly, she carried the key to something no one could ever take away again, the unshakable knowledge of her own worth. And in boardrooms and dining rooms across the city, the conversations were slowly changing, one interaction at a time, one moment of recognition at a time, one act of dignity at a time. Because sometimes revolution comes not with grand gestures or dramatic speeches, but with the quiet insistence that every person deserves to be seen, heard, and valued, whether they're serving your coffee or changing your world. And have you ever served with your heart and been ignored? Have you ever stood quietly while someone else took credit for your work or blamed you for their mistakes? Tell me your story in the comments. If this story touched your soul, leave a like and subscribe so it reaches another woman who also deserves to be seen, another person who needs to know that dignity cannot be taken away, only given up. Maria's journey from invisibility to recognition wasn't just about one woman finding justice. It was about all of us learning to see the humanity in every person who serves us, who cleans for us, who makes our daily lives possible through their quiet dedication. It was about understanding that wealth without character is poverty dressed in expensive clothes, and that true success is measured not by what we accumulate, but by what we contribute. Her story reminds us that the most profound transformations often begin with the simplest acts, a false accusation that revealed truth, a lost job that led to found purpose, a broken trust that created unshakable foundation. Sometimes what looks like ending is actually beginning, and what feels like failure is really the first step toward something wonderful. The ripple effects of Maria and Victor's work continued to spread far beyond Chicago's borders. Business schools incorporated their model into case studies about sustainable business practices. Other cities began implementing open-door programs in community centers and restaurants. Young entrepreneurs contacted them for guidance on building businesses that prioritized people alongside profit. But perhaps most meaningful was the quiet transformation happening in countless restaurants and cafes across the country, where managers began questioning automatic termination policies, where servers felt empowered to defend themselves against false accusations, where customers started recognizing the humanity of the people serving them. Maria often received letters from service workers who'd heard her story, women who'd found courage to speak up when mistreated, men who'd returned to school because the Open Door program had given them hope, families who'd discovered dignity in work they'd previously seen as just survival. One letter from a young woman named Carmen in Phoenix particularly moved her. "I was accused of stealing from a customer last week, but instead of just accepting it like I would have before, I asked to see the security footage. They found the missing earring in the customer's coat pocket. Your story gave me the courage to fight for myself. Thank you for showing us that our dignity matters." These stories accumulated like prayers, each one a reminder that injustice was not inevitable, that systems could change when people insisted on their worth, that the quiet revolution Maria had started was spreading one conversation, one confrontation, one act of courage at a time. The 5th anniversary of Maria's firing approached with the weight of milestone and memory. Le Bernardin Noir had changed ownership twice in the intervening years, each new management team trying to distance itself from the scandal that had damaged the restaurant's reputation. The elegant dining room remained much the same, but the culture had shifted subtly. Servers reporting management that was more responsive to staff concerns, policies that provided some protection against customer abuse. Victor no longer ate there, his palate and values having evolved beyond what the restaurant represented. But sometimes he would walk past on Michigan Avenue, remembering the man he'd been that December night, the casual cruelty he'd wielded without thought, the life he'd nearly destroyed through prejudice and pride. The man walking past the restaurant now was fundamentally different, transformed not by sudden revelation, but by years of daily choice to see people rather than just services, to listen rather than just consume, to understand that wealth was a tool for building community rather than just accumulating comfort. Maria marked the anniversary quietly, with a moment of silence during the morning staff meeting at the original Corazon Café. Not because she was mourning what had happened, but because she was grateful for what it had taught her, for the strength it had revealed in herself, for the path it had opened toward a life of purpose and partnership. 5 years ago, she told the assembled staff, servers and cooks, managers and hosts, all of them earning living wages with full benefits in an industry that typically offered neither. I learned that losing your job doesn't mean losing your value, that being fired doesn't mean being finished, that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you creates space for the best thing that's going to happen. The applause was warm, genuine, filled with the appreciation of people who understood the courage required to rebuild from rubble, to transform humiliation into purpose, to create something beautiful from something broken. After the meeting, Maria walked to Vita Nova, checking on the lunch preparation, greeting staff who'd become colleagues and partners in the work of dignified service. The restaurant had evolved over the years, adding programs that supported local farmers, initiatives that reduced food waste, partnerships with culinary schools that created pathways for aspiring chefs from underserved communities. The afternoon brought a surprise visitor. James Morrison, Victor's lawyer and longtime friend, the man who'd first revealed the truth about Bradley's deception and Victor's false accusation. He looked older, distinguished silver in his hair, but his eyes held the same integrity that had compelled him to right an old wrong. "I wanted to thank you," he said simply, sitting across from Maria in Vita Nova's quiet afternoon atmosphere, "for what you've built here, for what you've taught Victor, for the example you've set. My daughter graduates from college next month. She's studied your business model in school, wants to work for companies that operate with your values." The gratitude was unnecessary but touching, one more reminder that personal transformation rippled outward in ways that couldn't be measured or predicted. James's daughter represented the next generation of leaders, people who would expect businesses to operate with dignity and purpose rather than just profit and power. As evening approached, Chicago's skyline glittered against the darkening sky, a monument to ambition and achievement that somehow looked different now to those who'd learned to see beyond its gleaming surfaces, to the people who made it possible. In restaurants throughout the city, servers were finishing evening shifts with the knowledge that their dignity was protected, their voices heard, their worth recognized. The story that began with injustice had become something larger, a movement toward recognition, an insistence on dignity, a quiet revolution that happened one conversation, one policy change, one act of courage at a time. It wasn't finished, might never be finished, but it was real and growing and spreading like ripples from a stone thrown in still water. Maria Santos, once invisible, now helped others become visible. Victor Reynolds, once blind, now helped others see clearly. Together, they'd proved that transformation was possible, that justice delayed didn't have to mean justice denied, that sometimes the most profound changes began with the simplest insistence on human dignity. And in restaurants and cafes across Chicago, across the country, across a world slowly learning to see the people who serve it, the quiet revolution continued, one cup of coffee at a time, one moment of recognition at a time, one act of dignity at a time. To continue this emotional journey, we've prepared special stories about dignity in the workplace, about finding your voice when others try to silence you, about the quiet heroes who keep our world running. You can find these moving tales in our podcast series. Just click the link on the left. Thank you for walking this path of the heart with us. Your presence here, your willingness to see and hear these stories makes all the difference. I'll see you in our next story, where we'll discover together that sometimes the most beautiful flowers grow in the hardest soil.